All right, so looking at the first page of the review sheet, are there any questions on problems 1 or 2? Any questions on how to do problems 1 or 2? Or either one of those that y'all want to look at? Okay, which one? So let's look at problem number 1. So we're wanting to factor 7b squared minus 63b plus 140. Thank you. Now the first thing we need to look for in factoring is we need to factor out a greatest common factor. Guys. So here, guys, so the first thing we need to do is factor out the greatest common factor of 7. So when we factor it out, we're left with 7 parentheses b squared minus 9b plus 20, because we need to pull out that greatest common factor. Now once we pull out the greatest common factor, we're going to write our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. After this, we want to find the signs inside of each of the parentheses. And to find the sign, we look at the third term. If the third term is positive, then the signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, our signs are opposite. Well, here the third term is positive, so our signs will be the same and match the sign of the middle term, so they are both negative. Then after we find the signs, we need to find the factors of the first and third term. Well, the only factors of b squared are b and b. Now the factors of 20 are 1 times 20, 2 times 10, and 4 times 5. Which one of these factors do we want to try first? 4 times 5. So we'll plug in 4 and 5. And lastly, we can check it to make sure we do have the correct setup. B times negative 5 would be negative 5b. Negative 4 times b would be negative 4b. And negative 5b minus 4b is negative 9b. Is that the middle term that we wanted? Yes. So that there is our answer.
See, that's the, with everything else you've done since then. Yeah. So just got a question.
You're good. Any other questions on this 2 here? Any questions on 1 or 2? Questions on 3 or 4? 4. So we look at problem number 4. The first thing we need to be looking for is a greatest common factor, because if we're factoring it, we need to look for greatest common factors first. Now, since there's not a greatest common factor between 6x squared, 5x, and 1, we'll move on to our 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. And the next part is going to be to find the sign that goes in the parentheses. So we look at the third term. If the third term is positive, the signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term. If the third term is negative, our signs are opposite. Well, here, the third term is positive, so the signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term, which is negative and negative. From here, we need to find the factors of the first and third term. So we need to find the factors of 6x squared. Well, the only factors of x squared are x and x. Now the factors of 6, well, that's 1 and 6, or which one do we want to try first? Okay, 2 and 3. Now we need to find the factors of 1, which are 1 and 1 and 1. Now last but not least, we need to check it. 2x times negative 1 would be negative 1 times 3x would be, which gives us negative 5x, which is exactly what we wanted. So these here are the factors.
Wait, is this the first? Is this the whole test? Because there's Tuesday and Wednesday. So is this the whole test?
Everything that's on there. That's the whole review. Any other questions on 3 or 4? Questions on 5 and 6? Huh? 6. So when we look at number 6, the first thing we need to be looking for is a greatest common factor. Is there a greatest common factor between these 3 terms? No, but there is something I would want to factor out, and it would be the -1. I want to factor the negative out. We want the number in front of the variable that is squared to be positive. So if we factor a negative out of -3t squared, we're left with 3t squared. If we factor it out of 11t, it'd be -11t, and then we would have plus 6. Now we could have left it as -3t squared, but it makes it a little bit more challenging when we try to find the factors of -3t squared. After factoring that out, we can do 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces. Now again, just like with previous ones, we look at the third term to determine the signs that go inside the parentheses. Since the 6 is positive, the signs are the same and they're going to match the sign of the middle term, which is negative, so we would have negative and negative. After that, we need to find the factors of the first and third term. Well, we will have t and t, because that's the only factors of t squared. Now the factors of 3, well, just 3 and 1, because those are the only factors of 3. Now the factors of 6 are 1 and 6, or which one do we want to try first? We can do 2 and 3. And if we check this here, 3t times -3 would be -9t. -2 times t would be -2t, which gives us -11t. And that's exactly what we wanted, so those are the correct factors. Any other questions on 1 through 6? Questions on 7 or 8? Seven? So 7 we would do similar to what we just did. Now there is not a number or greatest common factor number between all 3, but we can still factor out the negative to make 4c squared positive. Then we'd have -19c minus 5. Now to find the signs, we look at the third term. If the third term is positive, the signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term. Here, the third term is negative, so our signs are opposite. One's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. Now at this point here, we want to find the factors of the first and third term. Now we will have c and c. Now the factors of 4 are 1 and 4, or 2 and 2. Which one do we want to try first? 2 and 2. Now the factors of 5 are 1 and 5, because there's only one set of factors for 5. And last but not least, we need to check it. 2c times -5 is -10c. 1 times 2c is plus 2c. -10c plus 2c is -8c. Is that the middle term that we wanted? No. Okay. So we could try flipping the 1 and 5 or the 2c and 2c, but neither one of those is really going to change anything. So really what we need to change is the 2 and 2 for, well, let's just do 4 and 1. So that didn't work. We can try it again. 4c times negative 5 is negative 20c. 1 times c is plus c. And negative 20c plus c is negative 19. Is that what we wanted? And that's it. Any other questions on number 7 or number 8? Let's look at number 9. We can look at 10 also here in a minute. Let's look at 9 first. This one here, we do have two things. Well, we have 196x squared minus 144. We don't have a middle term, but is there a number that multiplied by itself that gives us 196? Is there a number that multiplied by itself is 196? Well, there is. It's 14, because 14 squared is 196. Is there a number multiplied by itself that gives us 144? 12. So really what this is a difference of perfect squares, because, well, x squared would be x times x. Now, our difference of perfect squares really come, we have our two sets of parentheses. The signs would be opposite. Well, here we would have 14x and 12, 14x and 12. Because the answer key on the review sheet says 13 and 13, not 14, but it should be 14, not 13. Because it should be 14x plus 12 and 14x minus 12. This would be the difference of perfect squares. Now, if we checked it and actually did the multiplication out, because we can do 14 times negative 12, which would be and then 12 times 14x would be plus 168x, which would give us 0. But do we have a middle term? Well, no. Now, one thing that is interesting here is there a greatest common factor between 14x and plus 12? Well, yes, there's a greatest common factor of how 14x minus 12? Well, still 2, yes, because between 14 and 12 there is a greatest common factor of 2. Now, we can factor both of those out, which would give us 2 times 2. Now, in the first one, it would be 7x plus 6, and the other one we'd have 7x minus 6. Well, 2 times 2 is 4 times 7x plus 6 times 7x minus 6. If the difference of perfect squares works without factoring out the greatest common factor, most likely the greatest common factor will be a perfect square. Any other questions on 9 or 10? Any questions on 9 or 10? Questions on 11 or 12? Questions on how to do problems 11 or 12? All right. Let's look at 13 through 16. Any questions on 13, 14, 15, or 16? Can I type 441 squared minus 361 squared in the calculator? And if I type that in, what do I get? $64,160.
Yeah, that's what she said. Okay, so yeah, you don't have to go over that. I'll just write the big calculator across the paper and I'll not track it.
Because we can type these in, they're just straight numbers.
Hey, can you be quiet, please? Thank you.
Questions on this here?
Yeah, I want to shut up.
Yeah, so let's look at 17 through 23. Questions on 17 or 18?
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the directions? Okay,
You got it. Anything it takes. Blood, sweat, glory, tears. You gotta solve it.
so what are the 5 ways that we've gone over for solving quadratics? So we had the quadratic equation. I'm just writing these down because that is one of the methods. We had 5 different ways to solve them. What was one of the other ways? Huh? What other ways did we have to solve these?
Man, we also wrote it down right now.
Because we had completing the square, we had the square root method. We also had graphing. Because we first off started off by solving these by factoring. We went over how to graph and solve these. The square root method, which really works if we have a set of parentheses squared and no other variable outside of it, or we have x squared. We don't have a term variable x. So we can look at number 17 first. Well, if we can solve it by any method, the first thing we could try to do is graph it. Because if we graph this and it gives us 2 whole number solutions on the graph, we have our answers and we're done. Now, if we want to factor it, we can do that as well. Because we'd start off with 2 sets of parentheses with 3 spaces.
I just want to know what kind of prescription you're on to take care of all these things each day. I think volume helps, doesn't it?
All right, guys. Since the third term is positive, the signs are the same and they match the sign of the middle term. So they're both positive.
So then you just factor like
Now we look at the factors of the first and third term. Well, the factors of x squared are and x. Well, the factors of 2 are 1 and. Now we can check this just to make sure we do have it set up in the correct way. X times 2 is 2x. 1 times x is plus x, which gives us 3x, which is the middle term that we wanted. So we know that this is set up in the correct way. Now, according to the zero product property, anytime we have 2 or more things multiplied together equals 0, one of them must be 0. So we're saying that either x plus 1 is equal to 0, or x plus 2 is equal to 0. Now at this point, we just need to solve for the value of x. So we would subtract 1 from both sides, which tells us x is equal to -1. Here we could subtract 2 from both sides, which tells us x is equal to -2. Now we could have also graphed this function. Yeah. Just that x is equal to -1 and -2.
listen here. I'm starting to get that.
Now, we could have also graphed it, and it would have told us the same thing. Because when we graph, we're looking for what value of x makes y equals
Do we get to
0.
choose how we want to do on the test?
If it says by any means, yes. Any means or any method.
Oh, can we do 18 equals that?
Yeah, we'll do it. X squared minus 9 equals 0. Now again, since it says any method, we could graph it. If we're able to graph it and it gives us two values of x, which make y equal 0, those are our two solutions and we're done. Now we can also use the square root method because we do not have x to the first power, we just have x squared and 9. Now according to the square root method, we would get the variable that is squared by itself. So we would add 9 to both sides, which would tell us that x squared is equal to 9. Then we would square root both sides. And the square root and square with x would simplify out, leaving us with just x is equal to plus or minus 3. Because whenever we take the square root of both sides, we need the plus or minus.
Yeah.
And yes, that is the answer, Caleb.
Any other questions on this here? Now again, graphing would have also given us the answer for these two here.
I really like that way though.
Questions on this here? Questions on 19 or 20?
I mean, you could totally do 20.
Now, we could subtract the 10 over and get it equal to 0 and graph it. We can try graphing it to see if it does graph, or essentially we can get whole number answers by graphing. Now, the only place where x is inside the parentheses, yes? Now, we could use the distributive property and multiply it all the way out. But since x is only inside the parentheses, we can use the square root method. And the first thing we can do is get the set of parentheses by itself. So we can subtract 2 from both sides. Because these would cancel, leaving us with 4 parentheses, x minus 1 squared is equal to 8. Now again, the parentheses aren't by themselves, so we would divide both sides by 4, which is just telling us that x minus 1 squared is equal to 2. Any questions on any of the steps we've done so far? Any questions on any of this here? Well, since we do have the set of parentheses by themselves and they're being squared, we can square root both sides. When we square root both sides, the square root and square cancel, leaving us with x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus square root of 2. Because we cannot simplify the square root of 2, we leave it as just the square root of 2.
You go back up.
Yes. Okay. So because there was a set of parentheses squared, we went on and just left it as it is, got them by themselves, and took the square root of both sides. Now, from here, we still need to get x by itself. And we need to add 1 to both sides, which tells me x is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. Guys. Because again, we need to make sure we get x by itself. So x minus 1, x is not completely by itself. We do have to need to add 1 to both sides. Any other questions on these two here? Any questions on 19 or 20? 19? Any other questions on 20? Guys? Guys? So the first thing we need to do for number 19 is to get this equal to 0.
Let him do it.
Okay. So what do we do next?
Yeah. Quit talking.
Yes.
Oh, that's well, the paper,
Guys.
the paper, the number 2 looks like a 7. You're not. Hey, you guys can be
Yeah. Guys. So the next thing that we would do for this here is going to be to multiply the whole thing by 5. Now, the reason we're doing this, and the reason I would do this here, is because of the 1/5 x squared. And if we multiply through by 5, what is 1/5 times 5? 1. So we're just left with x squared. 5 times -2 would be -10, and we have our x. 5 times 6 is plus 30, and 0 times 5 is 0.
I thought you said 1. I'm sorry.
Now, this is helpful because now we've removed all of the fractions from the entire equation. And we can do this with any type of fractions, because if we find a number that multiplies through, we'll eliminate all the fractions, we can do that. Well, at this point here, we can try graphing it. We could have tried graphing it when we had the 1/5, and it will not graph. Well, it will graph, but we won't get any solutions from it. So let's go on and use the quadratic equation. X is equal to -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.
What is that?
The quadratic formula,
Okay.
or quadratic equation, or quadratic formula, actually, yes. As that should be. Yes.
I wonder what people just came up with. We should do x equals -b plus or minus square root.
They thought it was cool.
But what?
I could actually show you that.
Of course you can.
So what we want to do is we want to plug in the values of a, b, and c. Now, a is the number in front of x squared, b is the number in front of x, and c is our constant term. So in the equation, b is -10. Now, our first part of the quadratic equation is -b. So -10 is just +10. B squared minus 4, well, the value of A is 1, and the value of C is 30 all over 2A, or 2 times 1, which is just going to be 2. We'll do it in parts. The first part would be to simplify everything inside the radical first. Mm-hmm. 4 times 1 times 30, which would be -20. Because if we take -10 in parentheses squared minus 4 times 1 times 30, it would simplify to -20. Now, the reason we do this in parts is because since it's negative, the graphing calculator will do it, but it will not simplify the square root of 20 into a number we want to use. It'll turn it into a decimal. If we try this in the yellow calculator does not like negatives inside the radical, so it won't do it either. But if we take it in parts like this here, we can say 10 plus or minus. Well, the negative inside the radical is going to come out as I, because I is the square root of negative 1. And what that leaves us with is just the square root of 20. Now, the yellow calculator will take the square root of 20, and it'll tell us that it's 2 square root of 5, which means the square root of negative 20 is 2I square root of 5. Because anytime we have a negative, because I is the square root of negative 1, so this negative is going to come out as I. Because we actually don't have an actual number.
Because 5 times 5 is 20.
4 times 5 is 20. Square root of 4 would be 2. We leave the 5. Now, if all three numbers, 10, 2i in the denominator, or all have a greatest common factor, then we will simplify. Is there a greatest common factor between 10, 2i square root of 5, and 2? Yes.
Yeah.
10 divided by 2 is? 2 divided by 2 is? 1, so we're left with I square root of, and that right there would be the answer.
That's a lot of steps.
Yes. Questions on this here?
Oh, my brain's hurting right now.
Questions on 21 or 22? Questions on 21 or 22?
Wait. No, I got a question on 24 though.
So any questions on 23 before we look at 24?
23 different.
Because we could refactor that to a set of parentheses squared and go from there, or we can move everything over and use the quadratic formula. Questions on 24 or 25?
Let's see which one's harder. Definitely 24.
So we can do both.
Yes.
25. So the second step, because this one here, the instructions say solve each equation by using the completing the square method. So which this is telling us that we have to use completing the square on these here. There are certain problems on the test that will ask for a specific method for you to be able to solve it. If for some reason you don't remember how to do that method but know another one that would work, because completing the square and the quadratic method work every single time. If you forget how to do completing the square on the test but still remember the quadratic method or quadratic formula, go on and do that and get the answers. Because there are points assigned to doing it and getting the correct answers as well as using the correct method. It's better to go on and get the correct answer using the wrong method to not do it at all.
Right? I found out you write on your paper. You almost just about get a 50%.
Really?
Pretty much. Never would. I'm pretty sure you're going to name this points on test.
Now, when we look at this here, we have 5x squared plus 30x is equal to negative 50. Well, the second step in completing the square is to get the variables on one side and the constant terms on the other. Well, is it already set up like that? Well, yeah, the two variables x squared and x are on one side, the constant term is on the other. So we're not going to move the 50 anywhere because that's where it's going to end up being anyways. Now, the first main step in completing the square is a equal to 1. If not, make it so. So here, the first step is going to be to divide by 5. Because 5x squared divided by 5 would be x squared. 30x divided by 5 is plus 6x plus blank is equal to negative 10 plus blank. Completing the square is one of the few methods where we won't have the equation equal to 0. We're actually have something on the other side. Any questions on this here? The next thing is to find the value of C. Well, c is our b over 2 squared. And for this problem here, the value of b is 6. Because we're looking for just the number in front of x. Well, 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. So we'll plug 9 back in for c in both of our places here. Any questions on this so far? Now the next step is to rewrite this as a set of parentheses squared. We'll have x. Now the number that goes inside the parentheses will be the same as the number when trying to find c before we squared it. So since it's positive 3, in here we'll have x plus 3. Negative 10 plus 9 is negative 1. Any questions on this here before we move on to the next step? Well, the next thing we would do is square root both sides, because the square root and square would cancel, leaving us with x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus the square root of negative 1 is? Because by definition, I is the square root of negative 1. Is x by itself? So we need to do what? Subtract 3 from both sides, which tells us x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus I. That's it. Because we can't add, subtract 3 and I, negative 3 and I, so that's as far as we can go. Any other questions on this here? We're ready to look at the other one, number 24. Now, when we look at number 24, the first step in completing the square method is a equal to 1. If not, make it so. Well, since a is 2, because the number in front of x squared is 2, we have to divide everything by 2. Well, when we divide everything by 2, 2x squared divided by 2 would be negative 12x divided by 2 would be negative 6x. Negative 24 divided by 2 is 12 is equal to 0. Now the next step is to get the variables on one side and the constant terms on the other. So at this point here, we need to add 12 to both sides. And if we add 12 to both sides, we have that x squared minus 6x plus blank is equal to 12 plus blank. Now at this point here, we need to find the value of c, which is equal to b over 2 squared. Well, here the value of b is negative 6 over 2. Well, negative 6 divided by 2 is? And negative 3 squared is 9. Now at this point here, we'll rewrite this as a set of parentheses squared. We'd have x, and then we need the number inside the parentheses before we square it, which would be negative 3. So we have x minus 3 squared. And 12 plus 9 is 21. Nine plus 12. Square root both sides. And over here, the square root and square would So we'd have x minus 3 is equal to plus or minus the square root of. And last but not least, we would add 3 to both sides. So x is equal to 3 plus or minus the square root of 21. And the square root of 21 won't simplify any further than what it is already. Any other questions on any of this here? Okay. We'll go on and stop